All right, well, I think we're going to get started. So thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Ryan Haynes. I'm International Program Manager at Communitech. And at Communitech, we're working very hard to bring you businesses virtual like we have been as much as possible, while also supporting our members the best we can. So before I kick things off, we do this every time, but it's really important. I'd first like to take a moment to thank all of our courageous frontline workers, not only here in Communitech's home of Waterloo Region, but across Canada for everything that they're doing for our community right now. My name is Ryan Haynes, like I mentioned, but I'm very excited to be joined today with two excellent guests, both of them friends of mine. But before I give them a proper introduction, I do have a few housekeeping items to share. So firstly, pretty standard, but a reminder that this session is being recorded. We're actually going to be sharing it at a later date for companies or anybody to view and refer back to on our YouTube page. But you can find all of our AMA recordings also on the Tech Talks page on our website at communitech.ca. You may want to minimize your speaker view on the right-hand side of your screen in order to better view the slides that are being presented. I'll ask that you please keep your microphone on mute during today's session, and please use the chat functionality to ask any questions that you might have throughout the session, and we'll do our best to address those as we go. If you're interested in following up after the session to discuss anything further, please connect with your Communitech advisor or CSM. If you're not a Communitech member, please feel free to connect with either of today's guests on LinkedIn or reach out to any of us at Communitech. And lastly, we host an Ask Me Anything session around relevant topics every Tuesday, just like this one at 2 p.m. So you'll see some of our upcoming, one of our upcoming sessions on the slide here. That would be the Evolution of Events 2020 and beyond. So that's actually happening August 11th, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce today's guests. So we've got, joining us today is Alex Kinsella, who's founder and principal at Kinsella Marketing, Inc., and Candace Beers, who is Communitech's Manager of Public Relations. Now, I've had the pleasure of being a colleague to both Alex and Candace, and they collectively have years of experience and expertise in the field of PR, as well as marketing and communications. But you'll find that they approach the subject from a very different perspective from each other, as you'll see. So welcome, Alex and Candace. I'll throw it over to Candace for a little bit more about her.
Thanks, Ryan. So as Ryan said, my name is Candace Beers. I'm the Manager of Public Relations at Communitech. I've been with Communitech now for very close to a year, which feels really weird to say because it feels like it's only been a few months, but it has almost been a full year. Before starting at Communitech, I've been in PR now for just over 8 years. I started my career working at different agencies out of Toronto, so I've worked on a number of different brands. My career started working with the Home Depot Canada was my biggest client. I went from there working with Coca-Cola Canada to the Smucker's brand of portfolios to Google Canada, then to some health-based clients like Canada Health Infoway and a couple of others along the way.
Awesome.
And I'll pass it to Alex to share a bit about him.
I always learn more about you every time we do these things too. So my name is Alex Kinsella. Like Ryan said, I'm the principal at Kinsella Marketing. So it's just me. It's a one-person shop that I started just over a year ago, focused on helping with content marketing. So that's everything from copywriting for websites, social media strategy, lots of blog posts, podcast production, a little bit of video here and there where it makes sense to do. I've got over 20 years experience in tech. I've worked for startups to scale-ups to enterprise companies and everything in between. I've had roles in product management, customer service, PR, social media, software development as well. So I kind of bring a lot of different aspects from within companies to the way I help other companies tell their stories now.
Awesome. So as you can see, I mean, those are two very different backgrounds, right? So we talk about PR, and everyone thinks of something slightly different. And as you guys just illustrated, you can have various experiences in life and in your career and still dealing with PR. But I thought what would be really helpful right now is if both of you could give your take on just a simple definition in general of what you think PR means to you and how you've applied it. But really just let's define what it is and what it isn't.
Do you want to go first, Alex?
Go for it. You got it.
So for me, public relations is the umbrella, and then there are things that fall underneath it. So public relations is the overarching communications of any organization. That can include media relations, which is talking to media, investor relations, which is how you talk to investors, consumer relations, which is how you talk to your consumers and your customers through marketing and whatnot. And there are various other channels. Internal communications, how you talk to your staff, differs from how you talk to the public, those kinds of things. So communications and public relations are the overarching umbrella, and there are different facets within that. It is very complicated in that there are always different folks that you need to be speaking to in different ways with different information, but it's just the overall, that's my take. It is not an easy thing to define. And the first thing you learn when you start going down like the educational path of PR is that nobody can come up with a really fulsome definition.
Mm-hmm. It was a trick question. There is no definition, but Alex, I'm interested to hear your take.
Yeah, you know, one of the first mentors I ever had in PR always described it as working to get someone to tell your story the way you want it told, which is an interesting thing to take on it. I kind of look at it as, and similar to Candace, the relationship side of thing, right? So it's the R in PR, which is consistently telling your story, adding value, no matter what the channel is, whether, like Candace says, it's government relations or media relations or just the public in general. Do you have a consistent story? Are you building trust as you're sharing your messaging? I mean, you want people to talk about your story, but in order for them to do that, they have to trust that what you're telling them is true.
Absolutely, yeah. So the way this will work, I was thinking, now that we've got kind of the definition of the way, so both Candace and Alex have prepared what they believe to be the top 5 tips as far as PR goes, and you'll see that they're very different. So I think I'll throw it over to Candace for her top tips, and we'll go from there. Think of some questions as they go, and you feel free to ask them in the chat, and we'll address them afterwards.
Sounds good. So my top tips, I have 5. The first being that the word new is in news for a reason. So when you are outreaching to media or you're looking to get the attention of a reporter to do a story on your organization or what have you, it needs to be something net new. It is a very important element of a story is that it's something new. They call it breaking news for a reason. My second tip is very basic. So when crafting a release or crafting a story or a pitch to a journalist, what have you, you'd have to cover your 5 W's. So who, what, when, where, and then the most important is why. Why should the journalist's readers care about what it is that you're trying to get published? My third tip, and this is something that comes up in the tech industry a lot, is while you may be the technical expert, the reader is not. So you need to put things in layman's terms as much as physically possible, because the reader needs to understand what it is that you do, which in tech can be very complicated and sometimes come across a bit convoluted to explain. So as simple and basic as you can make an explanation, try to get that in your materials. The fourth, and this is something that has come up for me in my client history a lot, is it is okay to be part of a story versus the whole story. So if you and another like-minded organization think that you together have a strong story, but you wouldn't have full ownership of the narrative, that's completely fine. It's great to get your name out there and not be the star of the show. And sometimes it's important to do that to show that you're, what's the word I'm looking for? That you're a great organization to collaborate with. And then my last tip is that, like Alex mentioned earlier, relationship building is just as important as getting a story. So when you're chatting with journalists, don't always go in trying to get a story from them. Try and build a relationship, get to know them, strike up a friendship. One of the first things you learn working in agency, in PR agency, is that reporters need to become your friends. You need to go for coffee, pick their brains, learn what they're working on, get to know sort of the workings of how they put stories together so that you can pitch them things that are as complete as possible. Reporters don't like to do homework. They want everything up front, and having that relationship with them will enable you to learn how they want to be communicated with, to make their lives easier, which is in essence your job when you're doing PR.
And Candace, number 4, it's okay to be part of the story versus the entire story.
Yeah.
Is that something that companies, whether startup or scale up, should bake into their strategy in terms of let's not just always go for the getting the whole story when we're
Mhm.
just things, but you know, actually approaching things where, hey, you want to, like, there's a story here, we're a small part of it, so are you. Is that how they should approach it at least some of the time?
Yeah, definitely. If you are coming at a reporter and you don't have something net new to share, you don't have a raise to announce, you don't have a new product launch, going in and letting them know that, you know, you could be a credible expert on a certain topic. Let's say you're a tech company that has something to do with 5G. You can offer, you know, you can reach out to the reporter and say, hey, I'm sure you're working on some story related to this new 5G announcement. We're a technical expert if you want to speak to someone about this. Offer yourself up as that expert on those sort of topical stories as they come up.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Those are great 5 tips. We're going to move to Alex for his 5, which, like I said, are fairly different. But Alex?
So yeah, a lot of mine kind of tie in with Candace's. I mean, the first one about, you know, news has to be new. I think the corollary to that one though is like launching a new product isn't necessarily news. So a lot of times companies will, especially startups, will want to pitch, we just launched a new product. Press or the media is really looking for traction on that. So is there a sale associated with that? Is there a big deal? Is there a named company that would give you a quote in your press release? That can matter, and that can do a lot of stuff. I mean, the other thing that's, you know, news also is any type of raise, so whether that's, you know, a seed or, you know, Series A, Series B, and so on, showing that there's traction or there's fundraising is really good. I mean, and again, tying back to what Candace talked about, launching a product is a good opportunity just to say, hey, we just launched a new product. We don't really have any news yet, but if you have any questions about it, we're in this space. I could be an expert if you have another story coming up around this, and then you're building that relationship over time so that when you do have like really big news, big sale or a raise, you can kind of go back out to your contacts, and then you've already laid the groundwork for letting that news come out. I think the most important one, I should save it for the end, I'm just going to do it now. An interview is never time for original thought. You should practice, like if you're involved in any type of sport, you practice before you play. An interview is the same exact thing. You practice it, know your talking points, know how to get back on the topic if the reporter kind of takes you off on a tangent, but never ever, and I've seen it happen way too many times, but you've come up with a new angle on how to describe your product that hasn't been tested with anybody yet, and you just start talking about it, it'll always end badly. So again, interviews never a time for original thought. The next one, and this is a tough one, especially like if you're a very big people person, is reporters aren't your friends. They're there to do a job. You know, you might think you have a really good relationship and they're going to cover all your stuff, and then you get no coverage. And you might wonder why. You know, it's not a personal thing. It's just they're there to tell stories, and you might not just have a story this time around. One thing that another one that I think is super important is just making it easy for reporters to get what they need. So on your site, you know, have an accessible media kit, right? Really clearly labeled where they can find it. If you have executive photos or anything like that, make sure you have them there available, titles, stats on your company, if you're there, timeline. And the most important thing is having your logo available, especially in EPS or Illustrator, just so if they need it and they can do stuff with it. It always just makes everyone's life a little bit easier when you have your logo there. And then last but not least is timelines. So reporters have deadlines. So if they, you know, if you've pitched them something or they've come to you as an expert on something, make sure you're clear on when they need the info by. It'll help you with your relationship if they know they can count on you to be able to deliver a quote or deliver a story on time to help them with something. They'll be there for you in the long run.
Alex, what would you say to people who, in reference to your first point there, that launching a product isn't news, and Candace, you spoke to it as well, what would you say to folks who say, oh, well, look at Apple, look at Google. When they put out a new product, they have massive events around it. Is that just a factor of them creating this for themselves? Or is this, you know, is that reserved for the already uber successful companies? And so bringing it down to startups and scale ups and trying to grow your company, how does that factor in?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely who they are. I mean, if you're an Apple or a Sony or a Google and you launch a product, you already have a track record and people want to know that is news, right? You're an established company. But if you're a startup and you've launched a product, and especially if you're in a space where you're coming up with like a category defining product, which is even harder to do, again, it's a new category and a new product that doesn't have any traction or any awareness. So until you can tie, hey, this new product does this in this area and people are paying for it, then that's when it becomes news. And Apple and Google and everyone else already has that, as people are paying an arm and a leg right now for everything.
Right. Okay, so there's your top 5 from Candace and Alex. And I thought what we do now is have just an open discussion, Q&A session. So if you have any questions that you thought of as they were speaking, throw them in the chat and we'll address them. Right off the bat, we have one. Tammy asked, how do you get ahead of the story rather than reading about it after the fact? So I'll throw most of these questions out to both of you, Candace and Alex, and whoever kind of has, an initial idea, just go for it.
I think this goes back to what Alex and I were talking about, building relationships. So if you've got good relationships with the reporters that are going to write about your organization or the specific topic at hand, just, chatting with them ahead of time, being in the know with what they're working on and what they're interested in. I haven't had a virtual coffee since the pandemic started, but I have coffee with a reporter at the Globe and Mail once every couple of months, just to find out everything that he's possibly interested in, so that I can field experts from different companies his way. So just striking up that relationship to get an understanding. And
it's
then
getting form of business development.
Exactly. And getting ahead of the story as well. So just being prepared from a comms perspective. So if you know an announcement, a new product is going to be released, or we keep using the product example and talking about how products aren't news. But if you have an announcement coming up, have a strategy put together. Sometimes my strategies are literally just doodles on my notebook. So I'm going to go and make sure I email X, Y, and Z reporter. I'm going to put this announcement out here. I have my social posts good to go, and I time it that way so that we're owning the narrative as much as possible.
Okay. So it sounds like it's really just about relationship building. Like what I find is, our particular product sort of spans several different subject matters, both for the consumer and for different advisors and professionals. So that's a pretty wide scope. So trying to identify those reporters that might write about that, like in that space, well, it's pretty slow going. I mean, is there not some way to speed it up, or no?
There are research tools that you can utilize. There is the least expensive one that I can recommend is called Muckrack. So I'm going to put that.
I know what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So Muckrack has some really good tools just to understand what a journalist is interested in, what they typically cover, where they're typically published. That's a really good one. My recommendation when it comes to that is it unfortunately just takes time. Even with all the tools at my disposal working in agency, I found that the tried and true method that worked the best in terms of identifying the right media was just doing the research myself, putting the tools aside, reading their articles, getting a good understanding with them, and building the relationship and going from there.
Yeah, I found the same. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's another one out there called Help a Reporter Out. That's been around for a while. I think it got acquired a little bit ago, but it's still it still runs. But it's a great opportunity for you to kind of go and see journalists asking questions, and a research tool just to figure out who's covering what.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's really good. Thanks for that. And I guess my other question, sorry, I don't mean to monopolize the situation, but I just wondered, you mentioned that journalists don't like to do research, but I just spoke to a gal that writes for the New York Times, and she said that, I said, well, how did you not find us? Because of course it's after the fact. I'm reading a story. It's exactly about what we do. We're not mentioned. So then I say, well, how did you do your research? Because if you search us, you will find us. It's pretty easy. Well, even the subject matter, you don't have to search us at all. She was like, oh, I don't go to Google. I just kind of look at different and she kind of trailed off. It didn't really tell me where she sort of would go for her sources. And so it was like how that sort of leads back to the first question. It's like, how do you get in front of the story? I don't like reading about it after the fact and not being included. So that's what I'm trying, the nut I'm trying to crack today is exactly that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your questions. Those really insightful questions. And obviously, there's tentacles to everything, right? You can go down the product and tools aspect as well, versus the approach. I'm just looking at another question here from Wendy, actually. How important is community involvement or volunteering for company PR?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think corporate social responsibility, and I think, volunteering ties into that, on how you're giving back and how you're part of a community. I think it just ties into, is that part of your value prop as an organization? How does it tie in to you? I think for startups, probably right off the bat, I mean, volunteering is super good. You should definitely do it. I don't think it really plays into your PR right away. I think you see it as you gain more traction and start to grow, that showcasing that is a good way to kind of help grow your brand.
So it's not just a brownie points fix, if you will. That's not the approach you should be taking.
And like anything, I mean, if you're, and like, I'll say this for anyone building a startup, or if you've got a scaling company now, building that into the DNA of your company is very, very important. I mean, if you wait 2 or 3 years and then start trying to build that in, it's going to be a lot harder to do than if you make it part of, giving back is just part of who your company is.
Mm-hmm.
You can also refer to like company giving and volunteering as part of corporate social responsibility, which, when you think about it, people almost expect corporations to have a responsibility to contribute to the community and volunteer. So I think it definitely is an important aspect of an organization that you should consider. Is it something that can be leveraged for PR? You bet.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very powerful tool. Think of today's climate. People are desperate for good news, and it is really a really good way to highlight why working at your company is powerful and rewarding for people as well.
Absolutely. And so Sandy, I noticed, mentioned as we were talking there, talkwalker.com has an alerts feature that she uses often. So there's another resource for folks. So switching gears a little bit. So talking about COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're all facing, how has your approach, both Alex and Candace, changed at all with the pandemic and everything about it? So what has specifically changed in terms of messaging and possibly anything else?
I mean, I would say I don't do a ton of PR for my clients, but the one thing that I've noticed is, depending on where their customer base is and who their customers are and the outlets that cover them, like I have one that you just kind of you don't go all in on physical distancing, because some of their outlets don't really think it's something you should do, which is a little bit interesting to kind of shake, because I'm like all masks and 6 feet everywhere. And then I'm like, yeah, hell with it. Let's gather in big groups just in this press release. So I think that's kind of been the only thing, is just to be aware of those kind of things. But I mean, that's really been the only change I've seen.
So as far as the fundamental way you approach doing it, other than the physical aspect, it's unchanged.
It's like Candace says, I mean, you can't do like in-person coffees now. And I still like in-person better than virtual.
So what about PR in terms of, is there an opportunity to respectfully and tastefully take advantage of a crisis, if that makes sense, and have it work to your advantage? I don't know if that's the wrong way to put it, but who was it that said never let a crisis go to waste? It's kind of that mentality, right? Yeah.
So when the pandemic first happened, I think anyone working in PR can tell you that all they did was put everything on hold. Like, put everything on hold. Nothing is important until, like, we as an overarching country can figure out what the heck is going on and what needs to happen. And then it probably took about a good 6 to 8 weeks for non-COVID pitches to be interested, for journalists to show interest in those kinds of things. I think 6 to 8 weeks is probably fine. You do typically right now still having a COVID angle, because it is still, the times that we're living in, and it is still such a, I don't like the word hot topic, but it is a hot topic. It is beneficial to have an angle. So if you're announcing a raise, so for example, I worked with Rapid Novor this morning. They announced a new raise, as well as some funding that they got for some COVID related research. That's an angle that's going to help them in the long run get that story about their raise and whatnot out there. So if you have that it is helpful. I don't think that there was anyone, I don't think that I would have recommended anyone try to take advantage of the crisis. And I don't think I saw too many examples of folks doing that. Those that did try to capitalize at first got the shit kicked out of them in the media, to be honest.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's about doing it in a genuine way. And if you're already doing something to address the current topic at hand, then it's making that known, but not necessarily going after it because it's a PR stunt. Obviously, PR stunts are not good stunts. So, well, I'm sure there's some positive use of that, but not in this case.
I've done some good stunts.
Of course, of course. So basically, so talk about press releases for a second. And I'm thinking, okay, this was a question I was asked. So how often should a company be releasing or issuing press releases, first of all? So we talked about the relationship piece and the reporters and making that happen. But then there's the physical, digital, I guess, releasing of the press release. How often should that be happening? And then should they be using social media for the releases, and what other platforms?
So I'm going to give a really useless answer. There's no formula for how many press releases you should or should not put out. If you think something is newsworthy and putting a release together is a good communication tool for you to share with various audiences, whether that's through a distribution wire, you're just posting to your website, or you're sharing internally with your staff, or you're linking to it on social media, absolutely put it together whenever you think. I tend to err on the side of less releases, which is something I learned when I joined Communitech. Communitech likes releases, so I've fixed that a bit. The more the merrier is fine, just you need to make sure that you have those 5 W's that we talked about answered in each and every release.
Yeah. And I mean, if like we talked about earlier, like sometimes like launching a new product isn't news, but it doesn't stop you from, if you can answer again those questions, putting it in a press release and putting it on your site, it's still building up content on your site. So from SEO, it's going to help you. From like a reporter or investors looking at your site, they're going to see constant communication out, which is the relations part of that. They're going to be able to get the information they need. So yeah, there's no harm or foul for it. On the social media side, like I think it'll vary by company, right? Like I know a lot of companies, they publish a press release and they put out, a Facebook post and a LinkedIn post and a tweet about it. I think it's who's your audience on those, right? So if your audience on Facebook isn't media, why are you posting your press release on Facebook, right? If they're not gonna, if it's just customers, they're not gonna necessarily care, right? If you're, if you have, if your Twitter is, just mainly like a vehicle for you to communicate out to investors and media, then yeah, press release totally makes sense. I think you just have to look at each channel and then decide what makes sense for you.
I just want to zoom into that just for a second, because I'm putting myself in the shoes of a startup, and I might be asking, okay, I've got lots of things that, some of them might not be news, and I know that. Am I harming my reputation as a company if I put out tons of press releases all the time that I know personally are not going to get much pickup? Or is it best to optically, let's say to reporters seeing this and things like that, is it best to wait until I have something juicy each time?
Again, I think it'll vary just based on the company. I mean, just because you put a press release on your site doesn't mean you have to submit it to Business Wire, right? Yeah. Like it's on your site. I mean, I think on the social, like just even kind of tying that back to the social side of things, if you write a press release and post it on your site, that shouldn't be the only way you communicate that news out, right? Like that news then it has a customer facing one, probably an investor facing one, or version of that. So, you write a press release on a new product or like a new feature, that's fine, but you should have content marketing about that new feature that actually makes sense. Like that's part of your funnel, not just a press release.
On the different social platform side of things too. So think through like you said, Ryan, think through who your audiences are on each of those channels. So I have access to manage our Communitech Facebook channel, and I can tell you that it is mostly staff that interacts with the posts and content there, but we sometimes work, we can be a bit siloed, especially being virtual. So I don't mind us using that platform to share things because I know it makes our staff feel informed. Whereas when I'm outreaching for media specifically, I will email media directly. I will post on Business Wire. I will post on our website, and I will promote via Twitter because I know journalists are following Communitech and looking for things on our Twitter account sometimes. There was another question that was submitted on whether Business Wire was a useful service or not. So everyone has a differing opinion. I think it is super useful. It can help you reach audiences and journalists that you typically wouldn't. It also is a great way to just get your name out there. And like Alex said, it really helps with SEO to get those press releases, the amount of pickup that you get when you use a wire service. Business Wire, I find, is the most affordable of the services that I've used in Canada. There's another one called, they changed the name. It used to be called Canada Newswire, and now I think it's just called newswire.ca. I find it's just very expensive for something that just doesn't need to be, and it's quite automated, but that's my take on distribution services.
Awesome. And so there was also a point brought up in the chat about the Canadian Shield, and it's how this is all a great example of what the Canadian Shield has done since the pandemic hit. Candace, could you speak to what you've noticed that how they've approached it, and maybe some things that might have worked for them, and how other companies can learn from?
Yeah, so I think the Canadian Shield got lucky in a couple of ways. One, I don't think they took advantage of the crisis from a PR perspective. I think they literally saw a business opportunity and an opportunity to help and pivoted at the beginning, which is the perfect storm for a PR blitz to happen out of that, right? Which is definitely what happened. I think they've done a lot of things right. I think we've seen huge growth from them. And I think the business decisions that we've seen them made, looking in as a PR specialist onto the PR materials that they've put out there, have been really interesting and are showcasing a really good journey for consumers to follow along with.
Awesome.
I think they'll be the story of the year if we had a vote for story of the year. We should start a vote.
I knew when I saw Jeremy Hedges in that Tim Hortons commercial.
So here's another question, and it might get into a bit more nuts and bolts of how things work, but what do you think is the best way to present the quote unquote data nuggets? So surveys of consumers, for example, to the media.
So if you can tie them into a pitch to a journalist, great. I usually put them into the body of a pitch and explain, like, I'm trying to think of a good example. For Home Depot, we used to do these surveys around whether people were looking into renovating, what time is it now? August, people are looking about curb appeal. So we would pay for these surveys and then use the information that we got from them to pitch journalists. 75% of people surveyed in Ontario are looking to renovate their outdoor space right now. And that would draw their attention. We would put it into the pitch, into a release. Some data points can be great ways to just wrap stories around. Sometimes they fit nicely within other launch stories that you have planned. Again, useless bit of advice. There's no rhyme or reason to it, but there are definitely different ways of sharing those data nuggets and making sure that they're credited back to you as well.
Yeah, it seems to be this balance of how much research and work do you put in for them versus let them do their own to craft their own story, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm just looking at the chat here. John says he agrees the Canadian Shield has managed PR effectively and they get his vote. I think they get a lot of our votes at this point.
They've done a good job.
Yeah. So let's talk about, on that notion of key messages, because that is one, certainly the data nuggets, if you will. But key messages are obviously vital. So how can you, I've heard, you can redirect any answer to the same 3 responses. And so that's an easy way to approach it, but not so easy when you think about doing that for yourself. So can we talk about that for a second?
I think it can be hard sometimes too to distill everything back into 3 messages, but it is vital and the most important aspect of doing an interview and doing a pitch or PR for your organization. It can be especially hard. I know someone asked, should a founder do their own PR? It can be especially hard when you are the founder because you are so passionate and you do know the business inside and out. But really focusing on that 3 things, that's really what you've got people's attention spans for. When you're doing broadcast interviews, you have to remember too, if you're being interviewed for TV or you're being pre-recorded for radio, they're going to cut back your conversation and they're going to edit it down. So by repeating those 3 statements over and over, you guarantee that they'll be picked up and included within the interview.
Yeah.
And so, sorry, go ahead, Alex. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, I mean, it's especially on the editing side of things, right? I think that's where people, that you'll give a really good interview. It's like, especially founders, and I've seen that where, and I don't think founders should necessarily do their own PR, which we can talk about later. But they'll do an interview, they'll come back, that was a great interview, and then it'll be, a 10-minute conversation into a 30-second clip, and none of the points got across because it was this long arc, and it's like, it's like repeat. And like the more you do it, the more you notice it when you see other people, especially like in government interviews, when it's over a government official, and like they don't answer the question, and you're like, that's amazing how they do that. And like you just learn it over time, and then you just like, my kids want a dog, and I still give them like the same 3 points of why we're not getting a dog, and I never break, and I still don't have a dog. So that's exactly, it's working.
So there's no better time than now. Let's dig into why you think founders should not do their own PR.
You're too close to it, right? I think I think you have an agency, or if you can bring someone on to do it, and they can help you distill that down. But when you're the founder of a company, like you're obviously passionate about it, or you wouldn't have started the business. But then that passion also, because you're so close to it, you want the reporter to tell your story, really badly. Sometimes, you'll kind of slip and say stuff you shouldn't, just because you see them nod a certain way or smile at an answer, and you think that's the avenue to go down. But getting, and if you are going to do it as a founder, I mean, invest in training, right? Get some really good PR training, and practice. I still don't think you should do it, but
yeah, that's a good point. And that actually leads into another question that was asked, where the question was posed: what's the best way to work with a PR firm? Let's say you are a founder, for example. What's the best way to work with that firm so that you can learn as well, rather than simply just paying for the service? They do it all, and you're kind of just hands off.
I would say that's 2 different things, right? Because I mean, if you want a PR agency, you should pay for a PR agency. And like, yeah, you might pick up some stuff along the way, but it's the same as like if you have, contractors at your house doing renos, you're not going to learn how to frame, right? It's a skill they've developed over time. You can't just pick it up. On the flip side though, like there's plenty of groups out there, like training facilitators who can train you on how to be a spokesperson, on how to, you're not going to become a PR person, but at least you'll have those skills in order to kind of navigate an interview.
Mm-hmm.
From someone who worked in agency for 7.5 years, the firms aren't going to teach you. It's their bread and butter. They're not going to teach you. What you can do is, like Alex said, is look for those freelancers, counselors, and whatnot that will show you the ropes and will set you up with the tools that you need to execute PR on your own. But just keep in mind that it's time consuming. So it isn't something that you're going to figure out overnight. And Alex and I can do things the speed at which we can do them because we've been doing them for 8+ years. Yeah, I would try to find a freelancer, invest in media training versus PR campaign outreach.
Mm-hmm. And so that begs the question, what is the best way then to outsource your PR if you're a startup or scale up? How do you even approach it right from the get-go?
Yeah, so you can approach agencies and ask them for creds decks. You can contact me and I can share recommendations for agencies in the KW area, freelancers in the area that you could potentially work with, as well as a couple of folks in Toronto. The best method is probably to just talk to those get recommendations from people and kind of go from there. Figure out who's had what experience with what company and go from that point.
Yeah, word of mouth is like definitely the way to go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And ask Candace.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I said at the very top of this thing, feel free to reach out to any of us, including Candace, for that specific help. I'm noticing in the chat there's not a whole lot of questions right now, so if you have any questions, get them in, even if it's specific to your company, and you think it might not be applicable to everyone on the call. That's totally fine. We're happy to chat about it. In the meantime, I was hoping we could talk about, are there any resources out there, and perhaps there isn't, but we'll ask the question anyways. Are there any resources out there that provide a tangible, actionable or series of actionables that startups and scale-ups could follow, let's say, or learn from in their own time. So if you think about YouTube, or maybe there's a social media account that's like spitting out all these free nuggets of advice, or maybe there's a brand, kind of like the startup, the lean startup canvas, lean business canvas model. Is there something there?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, this question reminds me that I have create a PR 101 sheet for our startup and scale clients that I have not had a chance to do yet. But we'll have something like that. And I know Mars has one on their website as well that you can certainly look to on how to execute PR in your own. There's definitely no YouTuber that I'm aware of or social media account that will share those kinds of tips and tricks. But there likely are some resources out there that are very basic. Sorry, Alex.
And no, I was going to say too, like, I couldn't name any off the top of my head right now, but I do follow a bunch of people who are like PR professionals. And it's like on Twitter, and it's like the kind of the fly on the wall thing. So every so often they'll get into conversations about strategy or clients sometimes. And it's always just to pick up lingo and kind of like just have a little bit of understanding of kind of what people are talking about.
My favorite thing about following journalists on Twitter is that they post horror stories all the time of the ways in which they don't want to be approached, and they don't want to be the topics they don't want to discuss. And it's great. Very humorous.
Follow journalists on Twitter. You'll learn a lot. But no, I can see why those are your responses, right? I mean, obviously organizations like Communitech and Mars, we're addressing this and trying to help startups and scale-ups do this. But other than that, I mean, it's probably difficult to find, because it's we started off the bat by defining it. There's really no one definition of what PR is. It's quite nebulous. So I'm not surprised that there is no kind of just playbook for how you go about it. So there was a couple questions in here. So what kind of advice would you give a small business or e-commerce site for PR strategies? So Madeline said, I know our talk is geared towards larger companies, so totally understand if you don't have advice here.
I mean, I think again with this one, like if you're launching like a Shopify store and you've got a new product out there, it kind of falls in that bucket, right? Because it's a new product and people might not necessarily care about it. I think in those kind of cases, that's where Facebook ads and Instagram ads and influencer marketing are kind of your best avenue when you're launching a new brand like that or a new e-commerce site. But then it all ties back into, again, if you have traction though, that's the kind of thing where then, direct to consumer and any kind of e-commerce thing are still pretty popular with a ton of media. So if you have traction, if you have some kind of success or cross promotion with a larger brand or an influencer, it could be potentially news.
Okay, so another question that I'm looking at here from Taryn. So along the line of resources, what's the best book you've read over the past year that's helped you at PR in any sort of new way or built your skills? And Taryn said, are books still a good avenue to learn, or is it classes or hire it out or bust?
A book for PR. I haven't read a book.
Dump them, Taryn.
I haven't read a book in a really long time. I read all day long online. I've never read
podcasts we should throw in there too. Maybe there's a podcast on it.
I'm really big into pop culture. So I am a celebrity junkie. Like I like to follow that news stream because I like to see the ways in which stories come out, and I can sort of see the strategy behind the lines. So that's where I get my comms fix, I guess you would say.
I will pitch you on the best book for writing that I could recommend is Stephen King's On Writing. His memoir is one of the best things, just from a content marketing perspective alone. I've gotten better at writing since reading that. And none of my blogs are scary or anything. They're just normal blogs, but he does a really good job of talking about how he edits as he writes. And I think if you're writing press releases, or you're writing a script for an exec to go do an interview, being able to really edit on the fly, to get this, get the messaging right, and like just really like omitting all the unnecessary stuff that you think is really good. But it's just not. And sometimes, again, even as a PR person, you're too close to it, and you just got to know when to cut something.
I know there's been a couple questions in terms of what's the best way to launch, how PR would help when you're a startup announcing your first launch or whatnot. And Sandy had a great piece of advice here about talking to comms reps at partner agencies, whether it's your investor teams or whatnot. At Communitech, I receive information from our members all the time, and I do the best possible job that I can to make sure that we can help promote their news. We're all here to kind of uplift and share about each other, right? One of the things that attracted me to working in Waterloo was the fact that everyone in the Waterloo tech ecosystem, at least from an outsider perspective, and I think this still rings true, a win for you is a win for me. And so it's about uplifting each other in the moment that you need. It's not very competitive, and it is great to see everyone kind of lift each other up and share in each other's wins, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our ecosystem is extraordinarily like that. I mean, folks have visited from other places around Canada, and that's probably the first thing that they mentioned that I heard them say was, wow, this ecosystem is totally different than any others. To exactly Candace's point, that's kind of what we're like. So I'm noticing some things in the chat here. Stefania, I'm hoping I say that correctly, recommended Think, Do, Say by Ron Tile. Madeline said that HemingwayApp.com is a really helpful tool for writing. So thank you for that. And Bogdan said, if you would work for a B2C startup and we're launching a mobile app in the fitness space with influencer marketing, would a PR strategy help you or just defocus you? That's a really interesting question.
If you have influencer marketing set up already, I would maybe lead with that and see where you net out to determine if you need to add more sort of traditional elements of PR into your strategy. But certainly influencer marketing in the fitness space is a really effective tool. Influencers, especially in the lifestyle space, are looked on as word of mouth experts, right? Like, I trust what some of the influencers I follow for recommendations on certain products or services, dependent on who they are and who their personality is. So as long as it's authentic to them to be promoting your tool or your service or startup, I would certainly start with influencer marketing. It's a cost-effective way sometimes to work with people. Is there any intersection there? Or is there any overlap between the realm of influencer marketing and the realm of PR and press releases and that sort of, there is, yeah. Yeah, so there's typically overlap. In the tech space, not as much. In the tech space in Waterloo, I should say, not as much. But a lot of companies have an influencer marketing strategy that's separate from their PR strategy, but does layer back up to their overall objective of their campaign or project that they're working on. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts, Alex?
Well, I think too, just depending on the size of your influencer marketing program, the size of your brand, just also having your PR team being aware of who you have doing influencer marketing. Because I mean, like on YouTube and TikTok, every so often there's a flare up of influencers getting into trouble or doing something. So you want to make sure your press team is never surprised by having your brand associated with somebody who does something weird. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an inherent risk, right? With that sort of marketing.
Don't surprise your PR person.
There you go. No. You heard it here first.
They hate surprises.
So we got another question, and basically, first of all, I'm going to pronounce your name, and I'm probably not going to get it right. Chenakaya, sorry, I did my best. From Sweat Free Apparel. First of all, Candace and Alex are both awesome and super effective. So there you go. There's your aw shucks moment of the day. Any advice on how we can make the press release less boring? So talking about sensational, juicy, controversial, etc. I know that obviously Communitech, we employ sort of a sage and jester approach to how we write things. Maybe we could speak on that.
So the sage and jester is for our brand voice. For press releases, we have a different, I know it seems so like minute, but we speak more in corporate terms. But in our content marketing pieces, we use we call it the sage and jester. So it's just the personality that we try to channel when we're writing things, that if Communitech was a person, how would how would they speak, right? In terms of how to make a press release less boring, and I know, Shanakia, what the type of material that you're working with. So think through topics of the day. Think of a way to tie your release to something that is a hot topic or is a popular issue going on that you can tie onto and make yourself part of a story there. Try to speak and infuse your release with, if you have a customer testimonial or anecdote or something, that can sometimes help. The more quotes from the more sources sometimes can also be better, sometimes, not all the time. But if you're putting a release together and let's say you're talking about a new product launch that you already have lined up with customer A, B, or C, you can maybe get a quote from them to include, a quote from an investor, what have you. Sometimes having those additional quotes in there help a journalist out, in that sometimes, the majority of the time, journalists won't publish a story with just one perspective. They need multiple, right? That's why it's okay to be part of a story versus the whole story. So going to them with a press release that has multiple viewpoints in it can sometimes nab that spot for you.
So there's another question from Madeline here. Says, what should a brand include in a media kit? And do you have a good example you can share? I was thinking, is there a Communitech brand kit that we can share as a follow-up to this session?
The Communitech one's really good. Yeah.
I deleted it, I thought.
Did you delete it?
Our Communitech, I got to go back and check.
Check.
Our old media kit was not the best.
No.
I have to double check with the new website what it looks like. We definitely have examples somewhere.
Yeah. But I mean, I would say, like, again, though, in the media kit, if you have, if it's a physical product photos, lifestyle usage of a physical product are really important. If it's a software product, screenshots on device or off device, just depending on what you want to do with that. Logos, and then staff photos, depending on who you, like, maybe it's just your C-suite, or depending on like the size of your company, who you want to show, but just making it easy to kind of, for that reporter to get what they need to add to the article.
And as far as a media kit goes, you could likely approach it many ways, and I'm sure there's a better answer than some other answers. How would you approach one media kit to rule them all, or are you going to create separate media kits for separate purposes?
I think just one.
Yeah. One media kit should have your company logo, like Alex said, your company boilerplate, which is something that you put at the end of every press release that says about, I'll use Sweat-Free an example, about Sweat-Free, here's the about, and then a backgrounder if you have it. If you have the time to put it together, a backgrounder would basically like the background information to your organization. When were you founded? How many employees do you currently have? Where are you located? What do you do in layman's terms as much as possible, and any other pertinent information that anyone would need to get a lay of the land in terms of who your organization is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful advice. And of course, folks can connect with you to get some advice on what those key things to check off are. So Adam asked a question, one of the last questions we'll have here. As a B2B scale up targeting a very blue collar market, how do you see PR playing a role in brand awareness?
See, I like this question. So my brother-in-law is a shop teacher and a framer. And we were like having beers one day, and he was talking about, it was some cybersecurity company. It could have been probably isnt or something, but he was talking about like something they had done. And I'm like, we're in different circles. This is kind of interesting. Like you would, and he heard it on 570, and it's because Communitech had got them on like the tech spot on Tuesdays, and he listens to 570 all day. So yeah, I mean, I think PR is super important, no matter if it's blue collar or white collar. I mean, everybody reads or listens to the radio, and getting your news out there and having it as part of the conversation is super important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Think about the audience that you're trying to reach, and think about the media that they're consuming. So I've told you I'm a pop culture junkie. So to hit me, you would need to pitch you would be very beneficial to pitch a pop culture journalist or trying to get into some kind of an outlet there. Same with influencer marketing. I follow influencers that I think I can relate to, so that are authentic, what have you. So like Alex said, like if your audience tends to listen to the radio, focusing on radio outlets could certainly help. And I'm trying to think of other examples. If you know that the audience that you're looking to reach really only consumes media between 6 and 6:30 because they watch the news while they serve their kids dinner, then aim for some kind of a broadcast visual as well.
So focus less on who or what the publication actually is or medium, and more on why you're choosing them as your medium. So who is the end target of that? Yeah.
I get inquiries, and I have my entire career saying, well, we want to be in the Globe and Mail. Lady, I want to be in the Globe and Mail too, okay? Not everyone can be there, and not everyone that you need to reach is reading it. It's a wonderful national publication, don't get me wrong, but there are other places out there where your potential customers or your current customers are picking their news up. Mm-hmm. I used to pick my fiance's brain all the time and ask, like, well, where did you hear about that? Like Alex was saying, and I would get stupid answers, like they would watch Barstool. They saw it on Barstool Sports, so they saw it on Tim and Sid in the morning. Okay, well, it doesn't work from what I'm thinking, but it's good to know that you have to figure out those avenues of how people consume the media that they do, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I believe we're running out of time. So I wanted to take a moment to truly thank the two of you for taking some time out of your day, sharing your wisdom with everyone that tuned in today, and of course, everyone that watches on the recorded version on our YouTube. But once again, if you want to connect with Candace or Alex, you can connect with them on LinkedIn. We'll be sending that out as a follow-up after this event. And please feel free to connect with them anytime. Failing that, just contact Communitech and we'll help you out regardless. But also thank you very much for everyone that tuned in and everyone that will be watching it in the future. Like I said, there will be a follow-up email. And once again, we hope you join us for our next session, which will be August 11th from 2 to 3. So the same time slot as today, Eastern time, of course, and it'll be all about the evolution of events 2020 and beyond. So that's a really hot topic right now. You're probably not going to want to miss it. And I see all the thank yous in the chat. So thank you guys very much for tuning in and take care.
Bye, everyone.